Hi, boys and girls. So, we are on our last day before spring break. Yay! So, let's read chapters 28, 29, and 30. And I think that Mrs. Leggett and I are on the right page now, that we have these all the right way. It was because they combined 21, 22, and 23 in one chapter, and that kind of threw us off. So, last day before spring break. Valouche. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell. I have some wonderful news, she said. The children stopped what they were doing and looked up. They waited for Mrs. Jules to tell them the wonderful news. You are a very lucky class indeed, said Mrs. Jules. Mrs. Walouche, the world-famous dancer, will be coming here to Wayside School. She will teach you how to dance. Everyone was waiting for the wonderful news. Isn't that exciting? Asked Mrs. Jules. You will see her every Wednesday instead of going to PE. Will the girls have to dance with boys? Asked Jenny. I suppose, said Mrs. Jules. Gross, exclaimed Leslie. Yuck, said Dana. Will boys have to dance with girls? Asked Ron. Obviously, said Mrs. Jules. No way, said Eric Fry. I'd rather dance with a dead rat, said Terence. Everybody started talking at once about cooties and warts and other horrible diseases you get from touching girls or boys. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell again and told them to settle down. Mrs. Jules, I don't need to take dancing lessons, said Eric Brown. I already know how to dance. Yes, Eric, I've seen you dance, said Mrs. Jules, sarcastically. Eric Bacon was a great break dancer, but break dancing was no longer allowed at Wayside School. That's because every time Eric danced, he broke something. Mrs. Walouche will teach you the grace and beauty of classical ballroom dancing, said Mrs. Jules. Everybody groaned. On Wednesday, they all headed down to their first dancing lesson. Except Myron. Myron went to PE. How come Myron never has to do anything? Asked Jason. I don't know, said Calvin. I've been wondering about that too. Myron's father must be friends with the president, said Beebe. I think Myron gave Mr. Kidswater $1,000, said Todd. No, I bet he's blackmailing Mrs. Jules, said Jenny. How could he do that? Asked Benjamin. Maybe Mrs. Jules got drunk, said Jenny, and then she danced on top of her desk with a large lampshade on her head, and Myron took a picture. And so now Mrs. Jules has to let Myron do anything he wants, or else he'll show the picture to Mr. Kidswater. Well, that makes sense, said Mac. Except, if she had a lampshade on her head, how would Mr. Kidswater know it was Mrs. Jules? Asked Todd. No one knew the answer to that. They entered the room on the second floor. Welcome, said Mrs. Walouche, a strange-looking woman with bright red hair. It looked like her head was on fire. My name's Mrs. Walouche. It's so wonderful to be here at Wayside School. She wore pink tights and a sparkling top. I hope we will be friends, yes? She asked. Nobody said a word. All around were red and green balls. There was also one yellow ball. This was the room where Lewis kept the balls for lunch and recess. This was also the room that was always used for dances. It was the ballroom. So, exclaimed Mrs. Walouche, who will be first? Everyone tried to hide behind someone else. Mrs. Walouche put her hands on Ron's face. What is your name? She asked. Ron, he squeaked. Ronaldo, bellowed Mrs. Walouche. King of the Gypsies. I don't know how to dance, said Ron. Dance? Asked Mrs. Walouche. She looked very surprised. We are not going to dance, she said. We're not? Asked Ron. No, Ronaldo, whispered Mrs. Walouche. We are going to tango. She put her left arm around Ron's waist, then grabbed his left hand with her right and stuck it way out in front of them. Suddenly, the music started. Mrs. Walouche dragged poor Ron across the room as she stomped her feet in time to the music. Dump, 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 da-dump, dump, 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 dump. Hey! When she yelled, hey, she threw Ron up in the air and clapped her hands. Ron turned a somersault in midair, then Mrs. Walouche caught him. They tangled back to where they started. Ron's eyes were spinning in opposite directions. Hey, that looked like fun, said Maurecia. Do me. Very well, said Mrs. Walouche. She grabbed Maurecia and tangled with her across the room. Dump, da-dum-dum, da-da-dum-dum. Dump, dump. Hey! She threw Maurecia up in the air and clapped her hands. Maurecia turned a double somersault before Mrs. Walush caught her. They tangled back to the front. My turn, said Terence. Mrs. Walush tangled with Terence. The other kids stamped their feet along with Mrs. Walush. They all yelled, hey, at the same time and clapped their hands. One by one, Mrs. Walush tangled with every kid in the class. The other kids danced with each other. Boys danced with girls. Girls danced with boys. They didn't care. Paul danced with Leslie. Dana danced with John. Terence danced with Rondi. Allison danced with Jason. DJ danced with Kathy. Todd danced with Joy. Hey! They all shouted together. Of course, they weren't strong enough to throw each other up in the air. Instead, they tried to trip each other and throw each other to the ground. Hey! Even Kathy was having fun. Hey, she shouted as she kicked DJ in the rear. They also threw the balls at each other. Hey! Mrs. Walush began to get tired. Sometimes she didn't catch the children after she tossed them in the air. Dee Dee crashed to the floor. Wow, she said, this is more fun than murder the man in the ball. Hey! At last the music stopped. Dump, 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 dump. And everyone shouted, hey, one last time. Mrs. Walush clapped her hands. Wonderful, she exclaimed. Fantastic. They all staggered around the ballroom, cut up and bruised and bleeding. Next week, the waltz, Mrs. Walush called after them. So how did everyone like dancing? Asked Mrs. Jewls when they returned. Dance? Asked Ronaldo, king of the gypsies. We didn't dance. You didn't? Said Mrs. Jewls. No, said Ronaldo. We tangoed. Everyone cheered. It was wonderful, exclaimed Kathy. Fantastic, said Terence. Myron was sorry he had missed it. I can't wait till next Wednesday, said Todd. All right. So I guess they all danced. I can't imagine us all dancing in class. But it would be fun, having the fun that they had, except throwing each other around. Maybe not so much. All right, chapter 29, The Lost Ear. Mrs. Jewls was teaching the class about mammals. All mammals have hair, she said. Bibi raised her hand. Is my father a mammal, she asked. Yes, all people are mammals, said Mrs. Jewls. But my father doesn't have any hair, said Bibi. He's bald. Everybody laughed. Benjamin stared down at his desktop. He was very determined. Mrs. Jewls would be handing out report cards at the end of the week. He had to tell his real name before then. He raised his hand. But Mac had his hand raised. Yes, Mac, said Mrs. Jewls. I heard about a man who was getting his hair cut, said Mac, and the barber cut off one of the man's ears. See, the man had very long hair. I think he was a hippie, so the barber couldn't see his ear until it fell on the floor. Thank you, Mac, said Mrs. Jewls. That was a very interesting story. I'm not finished, said Mac. When the barber saw the ear on the floor, he said, Is that your ear on the floor? And then the hippie said, What? I can't hear you. So the barber showed him his ear, and then he called an ambulance to take the hippie to the hospital. Were they able to put the ear back on? Asked Todd. Well, see, Mac said the doctors were all set to sew it in his head. They were all in the operating room and everything, but suddenly they couldn't find the ear. Man, they looked everywhere for it. Did they look under the operating table? Asked Joy. Yep, said Mac. It wasn't there. How about the bathroom? Asked Eric Bacon. Maybe they lost it when they had washed their hands. They looked, but it wasn't there. Did they leave it at the barber shop? Asked Jenny. Nope. Did they ever find it? Asked Allison. Yes, said Mac, but you'll never guess where. In the refrigerator, grumbled Mrs. Jewls. No, how would it get there? Asked Mac. Well, we really need to get back to mammals, Mrs. Jewls said. Yes, Mark? Benjamin lowered his head. My name's not Mark, he said. My name is really Benjamin Nushmut, and I came from Hempleton, not Macedonia. Fine, said Mrs. Jewls, but we're talking about mammals. Now the whale is the largest mammal. Even though it lives in the ocean, it is still a mammal, not a fish. Do whales have hair? Asked John. Yes, said Mrs. Jewls. Dana laughed. A whale with pigtails, she exclaimed. Boy, I'd love to pull one of those, said Paul. Benjamin couldn't believe it. Didn't you hear what I said? He asked. Yes, Benjamin, said Mrs. Jewls. Well, You don't think I'm strange? Asked Benjamin. All this time you've been calling me by the wrong name, and I've never told you. Don't you think I'm crazy? No, said Mrs. Jules. Benjamin was getting upset. Well, don't you think it's a stupid name, Benjamin Nushmut? He looked around at his classmates. Doesn't anybody think I'm weird? No, you're not weird, said Sherry. I'll tell you what's weird. What's weird is bringing a hobo to school for a show and tell. I'm the one who's weird. You're not weird, said Baby. What's weird is telling everyone you have a brother when you don't. I'm the weirdo. You call that weird? Exclaimed Stephen. I'm weird. Who else would choke himself just to look nice? That's not weird, said Jenny. That's normal. Try reading a story backward. That's weird. I'm the weird one in this class. That's a laugh, said Rondi. If you're so weird, then how come you never ask Louis to kick you in the teeth? I'm the one who's weird. No, that's not crazy or weird, said Todd. I'll tell you what's crazy. What's crazy is that we all go to school on the 13th floor and the bathrooms are all the way down on the 1st. Everyone agreed with that, even Mrs. Jules. Benjamin shook his head. What a bunch of weirdos, he thought. Then he smiled. He felt proud to be in a class where nobody was strange because nobody was normal. Oh, that must be your lunch, said Mrs. Jules. She gave Benjamin the white paper sack that had been sitting on her desk since Benjamin's first day of school. At lunch, Allison headed down the stairs. Mark, she exclaimed. Hi, Allison, said Mark Miller. Long time no see. He carried a white paper sack, just like Benjamin's. Allison was afraid she was back on the 19th story. Don't worry, said Mark. Suddenly everyone realized my name is Mark Miller, and not Benjamin Nushmut. And that's when Mrs. Zarves gave me this bag and told me to take it to the hospital. Is it your lunch? Asked Allison. Look inside, said Mark. He handed her the bag. Allison looked inside. It was an ear. Allison's eyes lit up. Oh, now I get it, she exclaimed. I understand everything. There's no Miss Zarves. See, Mac was talking about the ear, then Benjamin Nushmut, said his name wasn't Mark Miller, so that means you. What? Allison looked very confused. Never mind, she mumbled. Just for a second, Allison had understood everything, but then she lost it. What do you think? Do we think that how did Mark Miller get the ear inside the bag? What did Allison think? All right, last chapter in Wayside School is falling down. Wayside School is falling down. A strong wind whooshed around the playground in the early morning before school, blowing dirt and leaves in the faces of the children. When the bell rang, they could hardly make it from the playground to the school. The wind was blowing directly at them, pushing their hair straight back. With every gust of wind, the school was teetering one way, then tottering the other. As they headed up the stairs, they could feel the building sway back and forth. The higher they got, the more it swayed. Hooray, yelled Kathy. Wayside School is falling down. What are you so happy about? Asked Joe. We'll all die. Yes, but we won't have to do our homework, said Kathy. They entered the room on the 13th story. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell. Find your seats, she said. That wasn't easy. All the desks were crammed together from one side of the room. The building swayed and the desks slid to the other side of the room. Finally, the children all found their seats and planted their feet firmly on the floor. We are going to have a fire drill today, said Mrs. Jules. Let's be prepared. Who is our door monitor this week? I am, said Maricia. Good, said Mrs. Jules. Who is our help monitor? I am, said Jason. Very good, said Mrs. Jules. You have a very big mouth. Stephen raised his hand. What if there really is a fire? He asked. There's not going to be a real fire, said Mrs. Jules. It's just a drill. I know, but what if there really was a fire? Asked Stephen, and the firemen won't come because they think it's a drill. The school would burn down. Don't worry, said Kathy. The school is not going to burn down. It's going to fall down. Bleep, 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 bleep. It was the fire drill. Maricia, the door monitor, held open the door. Jason, the help monitor, ran to the window. Help, he screamed. Save us. We're up here. Help, help. Mrs. Jules led the children out of her room. If there was a real fire, the children might not be able to see her because of the smoke, so she constantly rang her cowbell. There wouldn't be time to go all the way downstairs either. Mrs. Jules led them through the ladder through the trap door on the roof. If there was a real fire, helicopters would rescue them. The wind was even worse on the roof than it was on the playground. Mrs. Jules stood in the center and held the cowbell high above her head. She looked just like the Statue of Liberty. "Everyone stay away from the edge," she warned. Kathy sang a song. "Wayside School is falling down, falling down." "It's not falling down," said Stephen. "It's burning down. And no one will rescue us because they think it's a drill." Jenny noticed a dark, funnel-shaped cloud off in the distance. "Tornado!" she screamed. "We're all going to get sucked off the roof." The flash of lightning lit the sky, followed by a loud crack of thunder. "We're going to be struck by lightning," shouted Todd. "No, we won't," said Stephen. "We'll burn in the fire." "No, we'll be stuck up in the tornado," said Jenny. "No, the school is going to fall down," said Kathy. Mrs. Jules continued to ring her cowbell. Klabonk, klabonk, klabonk. The strong wind carried the sound for miles. Suddenly, screams came from down below. Then the whole building began to shake violently. "Earthquake!" yelled Benjamin. "Fire!" corrected Stephen. "The school must have been struck by lightning," said Todd. "Tornado!" said Jenny. "All fall down," said Kathy. The building continued to rumble and shake. There were more screams. "Listen," said Myron. They're trying to warn us about something." Down below, over 500 kids and teachers were shouting, "Star! Bringing purple!" "What are they saying?" asked Mrs. Jules. "I don't know," said Myron. Mrs. Jules rattled her cowbell. "Star! Bringing purple!" they shouted again. "It sounds like star bringing purple," said Myron. "What does that mean?" asked Mrs. Jules. Myron shrugged. Mrs. Jules rang her bell even harder. "Star! Bring your bell!" "Wait," said Myron. "They're not saying star bringing purple. They're saying star, bring your bell." "What's your bell?" asked Mrs. Jules. She rang even louder. The school shook and rumbled. "Stop bringing your bell. Stop something, Myron." Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell. "Stop ringing your bell. Stop ringing your bell," said Myron. "Oh," said Mrs. Jules. She stopped ringing her bell. Down below, all the students and teachers clapped their hands. But it was too late. Rondi opened the trap door. "Cows!" she exclaimed. The school was filled with cows. From all over the countryside, cows had heard Mrs. Jules' cowbell and heeded the call. There were thousands of them. They filled the stairs and all of the classrooms. There was no way for the children to get down. Helicopters finally came and took them one at a time off the roof. Wayside School didn't blow down. It didn't burn down. It wasn't struck by lightning, sucked up in a tornado, or destroyed by an earthquake. It was cowed. No one knew how to get rid of the cows. Cows are strange animals. They don't mind walking upstairs, but nothing can make them walk downstairs. Someone suggested starving the cows, but the farmers wouldn't allow that. Thousands of bales of hay were sent in. Several cows had calves. The newspapers thought it was funny and made jokes about smart cows learning to read and write. And so, Wayside School was closed. The kids and teachers were temporarily sent to different schools. Only one person stayed behind. He was there all day and all night trying to get the cows to go home. "Come on," pleaded Louis, the yard teacher, as he pushed and pulled the cows. "Go home, please, pretty please." And everyone mooed. The end. We finished the whole book of Wayside School. Way to go, third grade. So, you guys have a wonderful spring break, and we will be back after spring break doing our online learning, and prayerfully we will be back in school after that and see each other in person. Love to each of you, and we will see you very soon.